Have here with our great presenters. So welcome everyone to our MIVPAC meeting, the Minnesota Injury and Violence Prevention Action Coalition. We are joining together, as everyone knows. We've been kind of walking through this state plan that we developed about now 2 years ago, where we identified shared risk and protective factors that impact a number of injury and violence outcomes. And today we're focusing on the built environment, which I think is a great concept and sometimes hard for us to figure out. How do we address the built environment in our work? So we have some great presenters here today. And as we listen to them, I just encourage us all to think through these 3 questions that I've suggested at each one of these meetings that we think about. But how can each of us address this topic? Who do we need to work with? Who is not at the table? What are the 2 most important things that you want to do right now that you have the capacity for? And what are the next 2 things you want to do but need more or different resources? So I will introduce our 2 panelists, and also we're going to be hearing from Paul Hassan, who is our co-lead for MIVPAC from the Minnesota Safety Council. And after Paul kind of cues up the conversation, we'll be hearing from Paul Bachnight Jr., who is the founder and president of the Center for Transformative Urban Design, an interdisciplinary design justice studio dedicated to the inclusive and equitable development of cities, neighborhoods, and the public realm. Paul's been working in community-based design and development for over 30 years. He is passionately committed to working at the intersection of social, cultural, economic, and spatial systems, creating solutions that are equitable, steeped in place, and benefit each community. He is also the local convener for Reimagining the Civic Commons, a national network of cities using public space as a platform for engagement, equity, environmental sustainability, and economic development. And also, we will be hearing from Terry Quant, who is an accomplished experienced designer, researcher, and public artist. She founded and leads Dream Lab, a human-centered experience design collaborative. She has led research and created experiences for a broad range of clients, ranging from healthcare to corporate to community-based experiences, all from an experiential, functional, and multisensory point of view. Terry's holistic perspective always brings end users and stakeholders' perspectives into the conversation and into sharp focus, with an intent to design connections and conversations that lead to more inclusive experiences. She has designed public engagement at the scale of cities to inform urban design, and has created placemaking and public art projects at the intimate scale of human interaction. Terry is a thought leader in the topic of trauma-informed design and design for resiliency. So I will pass it over to Paul to continue to center this conversation.
Wow, center it. Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. I'm not sure I can center it. I think as I've been thinking about the question of built environment, my brain has gotten more decentered. And I think my role in this is to be the provocateur on the front end, I think, and challenge all of us to think about built environment. And obviously, Terry and Paul are absolute experts in the built environment. But as we're listening to them and as we think about our work, there's a few things I'd just like to encourage you to think about. I want to share my screen for a second and take you on a little tour of built environment thinking, at least alleged built environment thinking. I hope everyone can see my screen. All right. So the Safety Council tends to come at the injury and violence prevention perspective more frequently than anything else from the acute or the immediate risk of falling off a platform or getting hurt by a tool. But just like toxicology has endpoints that range from acute to chronic, so does safety. So you have this issue of acute exposure to the built environment in terms of crossing a roadway and getting hit by a car. You also have this chronic exposure to built environment, if you want to stretch it out to that point, to long-term exposure to diesel emissions from that roadway that you happen to live close. And so these spectrums stretch far and wide, but I would propose that in many cases, the built environment or the engineering that we operate on is actually an invisible safety net that we all often take for granted, but people like Terry and Paul are suggesting maybe we shouldn't take it for granted in quite the same way. I think this is something that we don't worry about in this country. We don't worry about our built environment tipping over, literally, because we've got a series of codes and regulations and standards and processes and professional certifications for engineers that all help us have confidence to some degree, at least in the safety of the built environment. But maybe it's not absolute, and I'm sure we're going to talk through some more of that with Terry and Paul. But I think the built environment also includes this. This happens to be the most dangerous road in the world in Bolivia. I have no idea how you can get two semi-trucks side by side on it. We don't try to do that in this country, but clearly how we build roads changes our risk and exposure on the roadway as a user, but we don't always think about how we build roads in terms of its impact on the other people and environment and social structures and economic structures around them. Most of the time in this country, you don't have to think about the built environment when it comes to taking a drink of water, except our systems do fail us. And Flint, Michigan is a great example of a built environment failure when it comes to exposures via drinking water to agents we don't want to be exposed to. We don't usually worry about our children chewing on toys, but sometimes we do, because sometimes McDonald's giveaway toys will come from a bad batch from China that have lead paint in them that's not allowed in this country, and we know we don't want that lead paint exposure. So another example of a built thing that comes into this conversation. Obviously, the granddaddy of lead exposure is lead paint in homes, which goes directly to the static built environment as we think about it. And just to put a couple more pieces in perspective, there's a risk triad that we tend to think about on the traditional safety side. That is, are you aware of the risks that you're taking? Have you taken measures to reduce risks to the point then that you're willing to accept that risk? So where's the built environment in here? Well, it's probably over in mitigation, and it exists in an older triad that relates to how you mitigate, and that's this triad, where you educate people about the risks. Engineering is put in place. It might be machine guarding. It might be standards for indoor air quality. It might be setbacks in green space to help with psychological safety. And then you've got enforcement, which tries to get the other two to do what they're supposed to do. But this is where traditionally, I think, built environment has been on the table. And I would just like to propose one more factor to think about in the built environment, and that is that time actually equals safety. I was in Georgia a few years ago at Georgia Tech. They have a lab there that was dealing with self-detecting driving automobiles. Audi had some vehicles in that lab that they were working on, and it became obvious in talking to them that time matters when it comes to particularly injury prevention. But when you think about it in the longer toxicological sense, time matters a lot as well. And if you have a bunch of vehicles going the same direction at roughly the same speed, a vehicle actually has time to react to a situation. Drivers have time to react to a situation. That's an easy environment to operate in. An environment where you don't have everybody going the same direction and necessarily at the same speed gets more complicated because you have less time, which is very different than when you look at something like this, where you have a variety of modes and a variety of types of uses and a variety of different directions and speeds. And this is a classic transportation built environment question, right? So I think as we think through built environment, I would encourage us to think about what Paul and Terry are going to talk to us about, and then maybe stretch that model out a little bit to also think about pieces like this. Because at the end of the day, danger equals the dangerous agent times the force or strength of that agent times where it's being applied and how long it's being applied there. And I think we can apply that to acute physical safety, chronic long-term exposure, whether that's environmental or psychological or related to trauma perhaps in the past, or it stretches out even further into extraordinarily chronic exposures to forever chemicals that have become part of our built environment. So thank you for letting me set the table. I will turn it back over to Catherine, and we'll enjoy the rest of the talk.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. So kind of to continue to create the table, I was wondering if Paul and Terry, if you could define a couple things that I read in your bio that struck my interest, and might be able to help us to understand a bit more of the work that you both do. Could you define transformative urban design, trauma-informed design, and design for resiliency, please?
Well, I can start off since I'm running the Center for Transformative Urban Design. So if I can't define it, I'm in trouble. So, I always come at this work from the reality that, the built environment is not naturally occurring. It's created by people, right? So therefore, all of the policies and systems and inequities and biases are all brought to the table when we are developing, cities, transportation, other systems that, things that Mark showed, water systems in Flint, like all of that is developed by people. So a lot of times we think of urban design about like, okay, where did we put the streets? What buildings are here? How do we think about their interaction? What goes where? I'm really thinking about it from how do I do that work in a way that's transformative to the way people live and to what they need in their environment to prosper. So when we think about it from an equity standpoint, it's like how do we bring just and fair systems to people so they can prosper and be the best that they can be. Therefore, our whole society is the best that it can be. So I'm really thinking about urban design from a much more social and economic and cultural perspective, because the built environment is a result of those systems and policies.
Yeah, and I think Paul and I have talked about our respective work, and I want to, I'll say sort of overlay or underlay that concept. I think what's been fascinating to me in my practice is starting to understand the prevalence and the prominence of trauma in our planet, but we can also say in our country, in our state, in our city. And that it's so prominent that, mental health organizations are taking a look at this and saying, over 70% of people have experienced trauma of some sort. And so and then there are people who adjacent to those who have experienced trauma, and that could be generational trauma, it could be an individual event. There are, some commonalities around the descriptions of that, but I think that the primary focus of trauma-informed design is to say, first of all, we have to be aware it's present, it's in the field. And it does emerge from the practice of trauma-informed care, which is a healthcare perspective on how to treat patients in trauma. So, it kind of comes from that place. But, in the work that I've been doing as a human-centered designer in the context of urban design and architectural design and a lot of different spaces, it is this opportunity for us to really recognize who's present, what's present. I think that, where we've started has been as architects and designers in a health, safety, and welfare perspective. And I think, and you mentioned this too, Paul, there's a psychological safety that is very, very important. And there's this constellation of meaning and perception of safety. So it is what we build into our infrastructure. And if that means like incredibly good lighting in a parking ramp to make it safer for the people who are there, that's one aspect of it, but it's also about the human perception of safety. And those are the kinds of things, the nuances of design that I'm very interested in as a designer of space, memorials or emergency departments or public squares, that we can infuse those moments of potential interactions between people in the most thoughtful ways, to be able to make them all feel more safe in those environments. And, to varying degrees, different people won't or will, right? Depending on their backgrounds and their histories and their experiences in life. But it is looking through that human-centered lens. And I like to think of it now as a humanity-centered practice, that we're saying, there is a need in general for healing. And that is on a kind of cultural and a community level. So Paul and I kind of, I think, beautifully intersect around that community piece. That is like, how do we create, how do we enable, I would say not create, but enable communities to start to rebuild for themselves what matters.
Wow, I think that last phrase that you said is really powerful. So you've mentioned a bit about this, but how have you both seen, or how do you see the built environment as an injury and violence prevention tool?
Well, I think there's a lot of different ways to look at that. Where I have been working a lot lately in this role as convener for Reimagining the Civic Commons is in the public realm. And so I've been spending a lot of time and doing a lot of research around how the public realm, parks, open spaces, other places really can be a tool. And there's some great research out there right now, a study from UVA and Cornell around how properly designed and maintained outdoor green spaces can contribute to a reduction in crime and violence. And I think what's critical in that statement is properly designed and maintained. And when I think of maintenance too, I think about, and Terry talked about this, like, how is it welcoming for everyone? How do you feel when you're in the space? Is it from a cultural perspective, are you comfortable? An example of that is in a park, in a predominantly African American neighborhood, is everyone okay with the fact that it's probably not going to be passive, and it's going to be like, okay, I want to have family reunion, and I want to have a lot of music, and I want to have a lot of people, and I want to have a lot of dancing, and that's not going to be, okay, we're all nice and quiet, right? And that just acknowledgement that we have to think about how people see and use open space, which is different for different cultures, is really important. So all of that work. And then the other one that's really interesting is this work that Raj Chetty has been doing around social connections, and the fact that for economic development, he's shown now that if you can have connections across lots of different cultures and class, that actually communities can prosper better. And then places where does that happen? And that's where we get into the public realm, our parks, libraries, schools. How are we really connecting and mixing? Because we all know that a lot of times we're out and we're with the same people. And we're not getting that cross connection, which I think is really important. So that's a lot of the work that I've been doing lately, and working a lot with designers to get them to think about, well, what's their role in that work? And I think, Catherine, your introduction to about what can each one of us do is really critical, right? Because like to get the change, like you have to do your work, change first. Then it's like, what organizations are you in? What do you do in your community, right? Like all of that is really critical to getting to where we want to be as a society.
Yeah, just I'm glad you mentioned Catherine's comment, because I immediately wrote something down when you said that.
Yeah.
And that was, what can you do? Insist that you are a part of the process and that the communities who are being served are a part of the process. So this is the kind of like agitator part of me a little bit. You know, in architecture, we have very kind of codified processes and systems and steps in the way that we do the work. And the place where this really, I think, needs to be disrupted is at the very beginning of the work, where we're really listening and learning from communities about how they use space, how they would, you know, how they inhabit spaces. We also do, you know, to some degree, some observational design types of research to be able to understand how people really behave in a space and what interventions that are there that are inadvertently causing certain things that we don't want to have happen, right? Like people separating themselves from each other. You know, if the goal is connection, you know, we have to pay attention to the things that cause us to now separate ourselves. The distracted walker is actually a very big concern in urban design, right? Someone looking at their phone and crossing the street. I mean, and you know, as a designer is looking at that intersection, or someone who's trying to figure out like how to make this safer for people, you know, we have to kind of unpack some of these other sort of technology issues and, you know, zones of experience where those accidents, those injuries are more likely to occur. But, you know, as someone who's looking at it through the lens of trauma-informed design, you know, some, but not all of the time. And I do see a huge link between trauma-informed design and equity-based design, is that there are some things, some principles that are starting to emerge in the field that are saying visibility is key. That there's a whole constellation, as you were mentioning, Paul, about safety and, you know, what that looks like. Some of the research that I've been able to do over the course of my career in architecture and design has been about health and well-being in the built environment, but also in exterior spaces. And interestingly, you know, what people will perceive as a safety element is not something we would define as safety. And so, for example, an emergency department study at Hennepin Health uncovered that cleanliness was the key factor in someone feeling safe in the environment. Having a security officer behind a bulletproof glass, however, was not a feeling of safety. It was safe for the security officers, right? And they were the voices in the conversation that were listened to in the process of the design, who wanted to have this very secure environment for themselves, right? But it wasn't secure for the community and the members of the community and the patients and the patient families and the people who are, traversing that space every day. And so that's just a, you know, kind of a little bit of a critique on the process itself that says, if we don't really pay attention to the people whose perceptions really matter around these experiences, then we're going to miss some really big things, right? Visibility is huge. You know, I have loved to use the parking lot experience in a number of different ways, but, you know, I don't know very many people who feel safe in them, you know, and there are very few that are so well designed that you take note. But I will say that the Milwaukee Art Museum parking garage is extraordinary. When you go in there, it's like your car becomes part of a gallery. You know, it's so well lit and it's so architecturally sophisticated in terms of the design of it. And the paying attention to the atmosphere is exactly what you do because of the design of the space. And so you are more aware of your surroundings. You're paying attention. You're probably not looking at your phone. So these are the ways in which beauty, which I love that it's a kind of a foundational principle for trauma-informed design, beauty and joy. When you bring those attributes into a space, people pay attention to those because they're aspirational and inspirational, if that makes sense. So.
It does make sense. Thank you. Yeah. So both of you have mentioned equitable spaces and creating safe spaces. How and you've mentioned some of the tips with lighting and now beauty, which I think is really such a great point. And I think sometimes when budgets are getting cut, we tend to think, oh, well, we'll just use a Word document instead of, a graphic designer or, something like that. But beauty can really make a difference in the amount of attention that's paid to something. Um, how do you create safe spaces? And this is kind of on the macro and the micro, but how do you create safe spaces, and how do you create equitable spaces?
So I'm going to take the how do you create equitable spaces first, which I think is the bigger challenge, because space is not inherently equitable or inequitable. It's how you design it, how you program it, how you use it, which then becomes the challenge, right? Or why you do it. So in the case of interstate highways plowing through, African American communities, right? That's an inequity, but that's because someone decided that the highway should go through there. So this is the struggle that designers have, and Terry and I talk about this all the time. That just creating a beautiful space does not make it equitable or inequitable, right? So really, when we're talking about this, we have to really think about, it's what Terry said, like, who are we creating it for? Are the people that's for involved in the process? Are we really thinking about, and they're helping us think about what the needs are for programming that space, where it should be, what it should do, right? Are we really understanding these bigger social and cultural and economic and political constructs that the space exists in order for it to serve the community in a way that they can use it? And then that really drives, and it gets us to think about, well, what should it be? A lot of times, we want to go to the big glamorous look at all of that, and a lot of times that's not necessarily what we need. But what we need is what the community really needs is the things that will work for them and will make their lives better. And I think those are the deep questions you have to ask, right, and spend the time, and then that starts to drive what you should do. And I think the other part of that is too, we have to pay way more attention to the built environment. We tend to just take it for granted. We're in it every day and we experience it, and we're like, yeah, okay. But for the most part, particularly places where we walk and drive, the built environment is really bad. it's really unhospitable. It really doesn't work for people in that everyday interactions that you have to do. So I think some of this too is work, like, well, how do we work on, like, just streets, right? How is it more comfortable to be on the street as a public space? And that's like one of the main connectors to how we get everywhere, whether you're walking, biking, driving, right? But what's that experience like? And then when we start to get to whatever the spaces um, are we acknowledging all these other pieces and then doing our best to support that? I think that's really what that's about. And then if we're doing that and people are comfortable and we've thought about it, they are safe. And a lot of that also is, when we talk about communities, that community is owning them. They feel like, this is mine. And people know, and it's used well. And a lot of the security concerns that we'll have a lot of times, go away, because of the fact that it's a well-used, well-loved space, and everybody knows that. I think here in Minneapolis, here in this region, I think we got to get better at spaces being a lot broader and used more. And it's okay to have a pop-up event at 10 o'clock at night in certain neighborhoods, and in other neighborhoods that wouldn't be the case. And to just be a lot broader, in terms of how we see space, something a lot more about public space in that comment.
Absolutely. I like to say the design tells us about what we value, you know. It's pretty easy in the built environment, like Paul was saying, that you can, if you don't feel comfortable in an intersection, what's being valued there. It's the car. I mean, we have some bike lanes, but I would also say, that in the process of developing some of these things, the mix between architecture, urban planning, urban design, landscape architecture, there's so many good brains out there, working on this work, and yet at the center of it, if those communities who are really using that area are not empowered and don't have agency over how they can engage in a space, if they're not feeling, and I think this is interesting because I did a little looking up about public health because, I'm not a public health person. And I understand that some of the principles are around prevention, right? So it is prevention. But I also think that the opposite side of that coin is permission. So there's always this kind of dynamic when you're doing a public space design to say, how can we give people permission? Is it ours to give, first of all? I mean, I would argue that I think that there is a kind of supremacist perspective around design and planning that has to be really fundamentally disrupted to be able to say, yeah, I'm not sure that really the people who've even been trained in this area necessarily should be literally leading the projects, right? So that's one of the questions that I have as a practitioner as I look at it and I say, the design of public spaces or the design of spaces tell us what we value, like in that emergency department example I gave, or for example, how we design elementary schools now. That tells us a lot about what we value and what we don't value as a culture. And I won't get into the details of that. I think we all know what I'm talking about here in terms of safety, in particular. But this is where we have to acknowledge that the absence of agency around one's own safety, right? And I think a really wonderful example of this, and this doesn't mean that I'm saying, this is not about a critique of public space or urban design of any kind, but in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder at 38th and Chicago in Minneapolis, one of the things that really happened there was the contrary experience of being of the power, that ultimate power taken away from someone, the slow death of this, lovely Black man who did nothing to deserve that. And for generations, this has been going on. And so, this eruption that we had, and I think to some degree, the empowerment, the natural kind of installation work that happened at George Floyd Square was directly a take back. It was an empowerment. It was like, this is our space. We are going to decide what happens here and what doesn't. And it was profound. It was profound. And I think it is important for us to be attentive to, and this is that deep, attentive, caring piece around trauma, that we have to acknowledge what's there, and that this is here in our midst. And that the natural tendency of a community in that case is to heal itself, to actually engage in processes and behaviors and creativity and generative. And this is the resiliency part that I didn't really mention earlier, Catherine, but am now. We design for resiliency because it's the opposite, if you will, from trauma, and it can be learned. It's not you have it or you don't. It's actually something that we can acquire, we can build in ourselves and in our communities. And so when we design for resiliency, we're paying attention to the natural tendencies for people to heal themselves through art, creativity, music, gathering. I mean, that became like the most amazing gathering space in Minneapolis. It was peaceful and joyful and grief-filled. It was sacred. And I think the natural ways that, the communities tend to create space are the things that we really need to pay attention to.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that because I think there's so much there. I'm glad you mentioned power, because there is the inherent power dynamic that goes on at whenever we're working, and who's in charge, who has the money, who makes the rules, and that's a constant struggle as we think about, um, you know, um, how do we create equity, how do we work as fit. But I think the resiliency piece, and I think particularly for BIPOC communities, there's a history of being resilient and being able to survive, untold atrocities, and surviving in urban environments, and creating place, where there wasn't, or where, and I think, we see that, um, as we continue, the work. And I think this is where the struggle is. How do we keep that energy and that joy when we think about what do we do next? Right. That spontaneousness, that, what happened at George Floyd Square, that how do we keep that in place as we think about it now, um, you know, as whatever it's going to be. And I think that's the really hard work. And that's about not just what you make physically, but again, how you program it, who shows up, what happens. I think that's where, as professionals, and I was fortunate, in my career, to have worked in a health center at North Point and managed the African American Men Project. And so, that interaction, in that space with people all the time, has really been formative, in terms of how I think about the work. And I often use the health sector with designers as an example to say, okay, the health sector has understood that prevention is not the answer, right? That if all you do is say to people, go to the doctor, and you ignore education and housing, and jobs and all that, you can't be healthy, right? And I think, as designers in the built environment, we can ignore all of those other things and say, okay, we've created, we're working on an equitable or just, or whatever word you want to use, descriptor. And that's where, that collaboration, and Terry, you named out a lot of the players, that will not always come together. Let's be honest, like, we don't always come together in that work. And sometimes we're at cross purposes. I think we have to think more about what that intersection is, and how we work with folks like you and other folks on here to think about that, in a much more human centered, holistic way, if we're going to be healthy.
Thank you. You both have given us so much to think about. As we're coming to the end, before we want to open it up for questions and answers and talk about how we might apply some of these learnings, how might folks on this call, working in government or working in community, be active partners in creating a positive built environment? What can be our homework?
I always say to people that, first is, and you said it earlier, Catherine. I think it's going back to, like, okay, what can you do? Because I think, all of the things we've talked about impact the built environment. So some of it is, okay, I'm in this field, I'm whatever, or even whatever I'm passionate about in my community. How do I get involved? How do I make sure that, that, things change, how that they're equitable, et cetera. And I think the other thing is, like, yeah, to pay attention, talk about the built environment, and let other people know, like, yeah, it is important. It's not something you should take for granted. It does impact you. You may not think about how it impacts you, right? But it does impact you every day, right? I mean, we're all going to spaces and places that are bad for a lot of reasons, and it does impact how you feel, how you operate. Um, so I think that's one. You know, um, get to know, and this is the thing I tell architects and designers this too, like, get to know the people who are working in the built environment. And I say the same thing, architects, like, get to know the other people, right? So that you understand where you're connecting, where you can collaborate, where you're intersecting, and how you can make a difference. I can send you a list of books too, because everybody who knows me knows I always have 4 or 5 of them that I'm telling people, yeah, you should really read these.
Yeah, I was thinking a little bit earlier about um, the Bartlett is a really good resource for they're doing like a series of workshops on inclusive spaces, which I think are incredibly valuable. I think, it is big and overwhelming, I think, to some degree, to think about like how do we impact these things. But I think that Paul's suggestion to pay attention, to your lived experience and where those places are, where you feel comfortable, and maybe also to be observant about how other people might not feel comfortable, and be aware of that. I think building awareness internally is probably the first step. And then using your own sphere of influence, like who do I know in this space? Um, and doing what you've done today, inviting a couple of designers who are really interested in this space to come in and, have conversation with you. That was one of the best, I thought, opportunities that I had when I was encouraged to come and speak to a bunch of judges in Hennepin County about trauma-informed courtrooms, and it's like they wanted to know, they observed it, right? They actually are, they are experiencing secondary trauma in family court themselves, right? Living every day through this experience of hearing really horrible stories, but also becoming completely compassionate and aware of how victims experience the courtroom, how people who are incarcerated experience the courtroom, how family members experience the courtroom, and they transition into the space. So, I think it's a matter of, reaching out and bringing people in to if there is a problem that, could be defined as a design problem, or maybe even not, I think the one thing that the design profession is generally really good at is a thing we call problem setting. And, to really sort of unpack where we need to go to solve the problem and what some of the parameters of the problem are, not necessarily solving it, but, helping to shape the questions.
So this is the other Paul, and I can't resist asking a question. Opinion statement on my part. Our current world, at least the North American world, is built around looking for shelter and throughput for vehicles. And that's about it. And so I'm wondering, how do we break this oath of fealty to this vehicular-based design? I mean, I think, again, opinion, I think Minneapolis missed a great opportunity to change the space in that intersection. And they chose not to close down the streets and to make it a living memorial and to remove the gas stations, which again are part of that oath of fealty to the vehicles, and to let that healing space exist. And so any advice as to how we, from the safety and public health perspective, can start to nudge us away from thinking about the car first?
Okay, so we don't have enough time to answer that question fully, but I'm going to take a stab. Okay, so one I think is that if we do not build public transportation systems that can serve everyone and make it so you don't need a car, because in Minneapolis it's still easier to get places in a car than it is on public transit, right? And I um, research is showing that yes, we can go to all electric cars, but that just means there'll be electric cars on the roads, right? Right, and not so we're not really going to get rid of the roads. We're just going to put a different means. So if we don't support public transportation and get it to be that people go like, oh yeah, this is great. I don't have to own a car. And I think the other part of that is then if we're not thinking deeply about um, how where things are. So the 15-minute city is not new. It's just that we got away from it, right? But and when you go back at centuries, like yes, everything was within walking distance, but we really have to press that. And it's not going to be easy because we are a country built on this idea of land and independence. And that's what it's about, and it's ingrained in our head. Like, yes, that's what I should have. I should own this house on this. I'm in right now. ULI is doing a thing on a technical, whatever they call it. I don't know. Anyway, a bunch of experts are here from out of town looking at Kmart, at the Kmart site. And one of the things that kept coming up is this thing about home ownership, right? So even when we're talking about a site on Lake Street, a transit corridor, in a very diverse neighborhood where rental should be important, we're still stuck on the only way to build wealth is to own a piece of the property, as opposed to what are the other ways to create wealth and opportunity. So one of this is going to be a culture shift, right? And so it's all about Mark's granddaughter there, and getting that it's a culture shift. And the thing I would say about the George Floyd Square is that there is still a real struggle around that, because there are plenty of residents who live around that square who said, you can't shut down the traffic, right? And I will say that I think the George Floyd Square thing is one of the hardest public space challenges that we have going on right now in the country. And my advice has always been to get some other folks who can help work on this. And the people that I always talk about are people like Mindy Fully Love. I talk about Walter Hood. I'm like, look, this is probably one of the most important public spaces in the world right now. We have to be way more humble in Minnesota and say we don't have all the answers. And who do we need to bring to the table with us to help us figure out what's the best way to do this work? And I think that is really important, that we're willing to say, okay, I don't know, but there are other people who can help me figure this out. So culture is really important, and I think our economic system too, because if we continue to say that the best way to build wealth is to own a piece of property, we're going to continue this. Okay, now I have to connect them, right? And the way do I connect them is with roads, right? And so it's a vicious circle. So that's kind of my maybe a long-winded answer, but I think the more people who push and continue to push and push your politicians and vote for your politicians who are like, yeah, we got to change this. Hopefully we'll get there.
I almost don't feel like I should weigh in on that. I mean, like the only thing I would add is I also think Liz Ogbu is another person who
She would be great. Yes.
She would be amazing to,
Yes.
And I do think what we are talking about are global thinkers on this, people that really have a big, broad perspective, but also I'm going to say centered American perspectives, the people that we have just mentioned are people who really have a consciousness around community engagement, community health from a psychiatric perspective.
Right.
They're people who are deeply aware of the racial inequities in our country and would center I'll say the right populations and I think that it is about centering a different conversation. So the fealty piece,
Right.
When you talk about like the gas station, this is the kind of conundrum of the both and, right? That was a small business owner, who lost their business.
Right. Yeah.
As a result of that no longer functioning as a gas station. And so, the development piece of this that Paul is so intimately involved in really has a huge role, I would say, in trying to shift, the investment possibilities around what can happen to support a small business owner, maybe in the same corridor, maybe not in the same location, right? But figuring out ways to build economic justice into the fabric of this place. And there are some organizations that are starting to rethink their spaces, like Pillsbury House Theater, for example, right up the street. They're doing a major renovation that's going to be much more about community center and creating an infrastructure of creativity, right? Which is really powerful. But yeah, the car, I don't know. I actually, I think, that it was not a bad thing when gas prices went up. And this is partly because I'm an older individual who remembered sitting in line with my teeny tiny little car, at the end of the 70s, trying to get gas. And I'm like, we need smaller cars, first of all, like these behemoth vehicles that are out there, I mean, I'm sorry if anyone here has one, but I think, we have become bloated, and that idea of individual ownership, it translates to your vehicle too. It's like this kind of strange, national identity around that stuff. So, we have been given a huge pass globally on gas prices and all of that stuff for so long. And I think that, there's a point at which we just need to, I'll say, join the world in the experience of urban planning that supports, walkable neighborhoods and, the 15-minute city and the ability for us to really even share, our resources in a different way.
Yeah, and it's a policy thing because the shelter piece too, we don't pay for what it really costs for housing, right? Because if the mortgage tax deduction went away, that would change how everybody sees single family home ownership, right? Now I'm not banking on that going away anytime soon, but it's baked in to how it works. And we're continuing to push, well, housing should be a right, not a way to build, not just a way to build wealth, right? Housing is a right, right? So we're in a system that supports the continual upgrading of housing and the moving out. And so all of that, I just think, I am an optimist, and we can look out and say, okay, 20 years ago, no one would ever have a conversation about, equity in design. Nobody was really talking about, green design, right? But now it's like, okay, if you go in a room and you don't talk about the environment as far as design, everyone's looking at you like, what the heck is wrong with you, right? It's part of the culture. I think we need to make the policy and the economic piece and the cultural piece now, okay, we talk about that too the same way, and people go, yes, right? Like I can't not talk about that and think about that in the work that we're doing. So I think that, and I stuck a book in the chat, which is a really great book, Cities for Life, by Jason Coburn. It's a short read, but it's a really good book, and it's all about, I mean, a lot of things Terry was talking about, how communities are driving the development. So check that out.
Great, thank you. So we have 4 minutes, so maybe we have time for one more question if folks have it. But this has been really, really interesting. So I'll pause if anyone has a question, would like to put it in the chat or come off of mute. We've got 4 minutes.
In this space, I do have one thought. And so a lot of this conversation has been more around the urban environment. And I think every one of the challenges that you describe exists outside of the 11 county metro area. It's just there's fewer people per square mile, which means there's less social pressure, there's less tax base, there's less kind of macro pressure to resolve the issues. But the transportation choice issue is arguably even more difficult in some parts of the state than it is in the metro.
Mhm.
The notion of connectedness gets hard in farm country, right? And it's so I think I'm going to have to try to, as I think about, we on the safety front, on the acute safety front, always split kind of urban and greater Minnesota traffic risks because they are very different. But 2 out of 3 crashes occur in the metro, 3 out of 4 deaths occur outside of the metro. So, we have a built environment challenge that's different out there, and trying to get policy thinkers to think in those two pieces is a challenge. So this just spurs me at least to think even deeper. And the health department for years has struggled with the individual drinking water supplies in the Red River Valley versus. So anyway, I see Dex has his hand up. I will be quiet.
I'll try to be quick. I'm not really sure what my question is in this area, but I've been thinking about this, sort of in a design, but as it relates more to products and a little bit of the built environment, because as you know, my world is kids and keeping kids safe. And I think about it like in transportation, imagine a world where everything is designed in a way where ability doesn't matter. So, in the space of like putting a child in a car, we tend to group those kids in this category called special needs, which I don't really love. I like to call them superpowers. But I guess my question is, are there people that are doing this work in the product area as well, or is that a tougher nut to crack because capitalism?
When you say, just a clarification, when you say product, are you talking about products that serve transportation? Are you talking about child safety specifically within transportation? Or just
I'm thinking about a lot of things. I'm thinking about, like separate issues, right? I'm thinking about playground design for one.
Sure.
I'm thinking about, the vehicle design itself, and also, the adjuncts that we put in the car seats, the vests, that sort of stuff. I'm thinking about, what I don't even know, because I can't pretend to be an expert in the area, but what are the other sort of home safety types of things that we're not thinking about in terms of just the ability of a child and the way that they move and interact with our world?
Well, I want to answer by saying, first of all, yes, I think there are product developments that are addressing very specific needs, and some of the most compelling stories I've heard have been, a spouse of someone who has some sort of a physical disability and literally designs the product that is the workaround for the challenge that person. That's where OXO came from, those kinds of products that really do enable us. I will say, though, that OXO's can opener is no better than anybody else's. Just, for the record. But I appreciate the question about children in particular. And I do think, now there are like 4 different age seating elements for children in cars, depending on their size, weight, age, et cetera, physical ability to hold themselves up, things like that. And even just, 27 years ago when I had my son, not so much. There was one, and it, like we just sort of tucked him into that thing, that was in the back seat. So things are evolving for sure. But I can't specifically mention a particular product around that.
The only thing I can say, and I was kind of racking my brain, is, and I don't remember, there is a lot of work being done in the playground space. And I'm going to have to dig around. But one organization that comes to mind is Kaboom, which is an organization, it's a nonprofit that helps develop playgrounds in communities. But there's another organization and another maker that I know is working specifically in that superpower space that you mentioned. that I just cannot come up with right now. But I know they're out there.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to be conscious of time. I know Terry has to go and teach a class, but this was just a great conversation, a new way to think about things. And you've really, given us a lot to consider in our work. And I love your connections with a lot of community connectedness, which was another one of our topics earlier, and economic justice. I mean, it's all, you touched on so many intersections, which is fantastic. So really, thank you so much. I'm so happy that we've met each other, and we will be in touch because this was wonderful. And thank you to everyone for attending, and have a great week.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.